1971, Stanford University, the basement of the psychology department. Here, in this ordinary basement, something happens that should have made humanity doubt itself forever. 24 ordinary students, no criminals, no mental disorders, just young people paid $15 a day. "36 hours into the experiment, one of the prisoners started screaming so hysterically he had to be released. 72 hours in, the guards had turned the life of the others into hell. And after 6 days, Professor Philip Zimbardo stopped the experiment. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. Zimbardo would later say, "I realized that people can turn into monsters simply because you put a uniform on them and give them power." But this wasn't the only experiment. The 20th century gave us a whole gallery of horrors disguised as science. And today, we are going to look into the face of the most terrifying one. Spoiler alert, the monsters are us. 1961, Jerusalem. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, sits in a glass cage. He doesn't look like a monster. He is an ordinary bureaucrat. He says, "I was just following orders." One man heard this phrase, psychologist from Yale University. His name was Stanley Milgram, and he asked himself a question that wouldn't let him rest. What if Eichmann isn't lying? What if an ordinary person really is capable of torturing and killing, just because someone in charge told them to? In 1963, Milgram decided to test this in laboratory. He recruited 40 ordinary men, the most ordinary you can imagine, workers, clerks, salesmen. They were told they were participating in a study on memory and learning. In the next room, the learner, actually an actor. He's strapped to a chair, electrodes attached. The teacher received a sample shock, 45 volts, noticeable but tolerable. The rules are simple. The learner memorizes word pairs, makes a mistake, gets an electric shock. With each mistake, the voltage increases. 75 volts, 100, 150. At 150 volts, the learner screams,
"Let me out. I have a heart condition. I don't want to continue."
And this is where the horror begins. The teacher turns to the experimenter in the white lab coat. The experimenter calmly says, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. I take full responsibility." And the teacher continues. 65%, almost 2/3 of participants went all the way to 450 volts, to the mark labeled XXX, to the point where there was only silence instead of screams. They knew it could be lethal, but they continued, because the man in the white coat said,
"Continue."
Milgram later wrote,
"I found so much obedience that I see no need for conducting this experiment in Germany. It's everywhere."
But Milgram studied obedience. What about power? What happens to a person given complete control over others? Philip Zimbardo, Milgram's colleague, decided to go further. In 1971, he transformed Stanford basement into a prison. Not a real one, of course, but realistic enough.
We recruited 24 students, the most normal, healthy, with no criminal background. We divided them randomly, 12 guards, 12 prisoners.
There were no instructions about cruelty. They were simply told,
Maintain order. You have power.
The first day passed quietly. Everyone felt awkward, didn't know how to play the roles. And then, on the second day, the prisoners rebelled. They barricaded doors, tore off their caps, and this is when things no one planned began. The guards crossed the riot with the fire extinguishers, and then they started enjoying it. By the third day, they were getting creative. They divided prisoners into good and bad. Good ones were allowed to sleep. Bad ones were forced to stand for hours, denied food, humiliated.
I didn't recognize myself. I enjoyed controlling them. I kept thinking, it's just a game. But it wasn't a game. It was me.
Out of 12 guards, only one refused to participate in the cruelty. Only one. On the sixth day, Zimbardo's graduated student Christina Maslach came to him. She said,
You are destroying these people. Stop this.
And he stopped the experiment. So he'd planned 2 weeks. One of the prisoners would later say,
I stopped being myself by the third day. I was just a number.
Zimbardo calls this the Lucifer effect. The theory that within each of us lives both an angel and a demon, and it only takes the right conditions for the demon to emerge. We've seen how those breaks under pressure from authority and power. But what if you could break not just someone's will, but their very perception of reality? 1954, Montreal. Neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield is performing surgery on an epilepsy patient. He stimulated different areas of the brain with an electrode, and suddenly the patient says, I hear my mother singing a lullaby in the kitchen. She had been dead for years. but the brain remembered. Penfield discovered that the brain stores everything, every sound, every word, every second of your life. The question is, can this be controlled from the outside? In the 1960s, this idea captivated not just Hollywood, but real intelligence agencies. Project MK Ultra, the CIA searching for a way to control human consciousness. They use LSD, hypnosis, electroshock, but there was one experiment that few people talk about. The Canadian Donald Hebb took a different approach. He wanted to know what happens if you deprive the brain of all information. Volunteers lay down in a special chamber, no sound, no light, no sensations, only silence and darkness. They were paid $20 a day, a fortune back then. Most couldn't endure more than a few hours. They began hallucinating, hearing voices, seeing monsters. One subject was convinced that inside the chamber with him was his own mother, decomposing alive. Another saw hordes of rats crawling up the walls. Hebb proved our brain needs information as much as our lungs need oxygen. Deprive it of signals from the outside, and it will go insane, creating its own reality. But the most terrifying experiment on consciousness wasn't conducted in secret laboratories. It was done in plain sight, and the victims weren't volunteers. They were unsuspecting people going about their lives. 1973, psychologist David Rosenhan asked a simple question. Can psychiatrists actually tell the difference between sane people and the insane? He decided to find out. 8 completely healthy people went to psychiatric hospitals across America. They told the doctors one thing: I hear voices. They say the words empty, hollow, and sad. That's it. No other symptoms. No medical history. Just those 3 words. All 8 were admitted. 7 were diagnosed with schizophrenia, 1 with maniac depressive psychosis. They spent between 7 and 52 days in the hospital. They were prescribed powerful antipsychotics, which they secretly flushed down the toilet, and not a single doctor, not a single nurse suspected they were perfectly healthy. But the worst part came next. Rosenhan told the hospitals,
Over the next 3 months, I'll send you more pseudo patients. Try to detect them.
of the 193 real patients admitted during that time, the staff suspected 41, but not a single one of them was Rosenhan's, and Rosenhan hadn't sent any pseudo patients at all. Psychiatrists saw illness even where there was none, because they were certain if he's here, he must be sick. The diagnosis became a prison from which there was no escape.
We discovered a terrible truth. The label mentally ill sticks forever. Even after we left the hospitals, not one doctor said I was wrong. They said, he is in remission. The illness stayed with us, in their minds.
Rosenhan's experiment showed a diagnosis is not just a word, it's a destiny. You put a label on someone and they begin to conform to it. The system creates the very illness it claims to treat. Where is the line between normal and pathological? Does it even exist? Or are we all just undiagnosed patients, waiting for our 3 words? But while America experimented on students and infants, the USSR was also searching for answers. 1971, director Felix Sobolov and psychologist Valeria Mukhina are making a film that would become legendary. It's simply called I and Others. A child is shown 2 pyramids, one with 4 rings, another with 3. Then they're asked, how many rings? The child answers correctly, but when the same questions are asked to a group where all the children, who are actors, give deliberately wrong answers, the child begins to doubt. And in the end, most children agree with the group, even when they see that the group is wrong, because being like everyone else is more important than being right. The experiment was repeated 40 years later, in 2010. The results were the same. There is another episode in the film. Students are listening to a lecture about high eyewitnesses' testimony is unreliable. And then people in uniform burst into the auditorium with machine guns, shoot into the air, and drag the lecturer away. A few minutes later, the lecturer returns, alive, and asks them to describe the attackers. You'll laugh, but the students' testimonies are completely different. Some say the machine guns were black, others that they were green, some don't remember at all. We don't notice how our consciousness feels in reality. We don't remember. We make it up. And finally, the experiment after which you stop believing in people entirely. 1924. A young scientist named Landis from the University of Minnesota decided to prove human facial expressions are universal. That is, when we feel anger, joy, or fear, our faces look the same, regardless of culture. The method he chooses was called the scientific approach, but in reality, it was pure sadism. He recruited students, paid integrity of burnt cork on their faces to track expressions, and then he made them smell ammonia, watching them wince, then showed them pornography, watching them smile, then made them plunge their hands into a bucket of rocks, watching disgust with their faces. But this wasn't enough for him. Then Landis brought out a live laboratory rat and handed the student a knife and said,
"Behead it for science."
Most students were horrified. They refused. They cried. They tried to leave, but Landis insisted. He said,
"The experiment must be completed. This is important."
In the end, 2/3 of the students had to obey. They killed the rat because the man in the white coat said that it was necessary. The funny and terrifying things at the same time, Landis' experiment proved absolutely nothing. His theory about facial expression failed, and the only thing it showed was that ordinary people are willing to kill if a scientist says it's necessary. No theory, only blood and obedience. So we witnessed 6 experiments, different years, different countries, different methods. They share one thing, the same conclusion repeated over and over with horror and disbelief. An ordinary person is capable of monstrous things. They don't need to be a monster. They don't need to be sadist. They just need to find themselves in the right conditions. Philip Zimbardo, the very man who created the prison in the basement, wrote a book. He called it The Lucifer Effect. He asked,
"Where is the line between good and evil?"
And he answered,
"This line does not exist. It's inside each of us, and it is thinner than we think."
Today, these experiments are considered unethical. They've been banned. They cannot be repeated, but the question they raised remains. When we watch the news from prisons, from the military, from hotspots, we think, those are the villains, I would never do that. But Milgram and Zimbardo proved you would. Or you already do, you just don't notice. In 2008, Milgram's experiment was repeated, with one change. Subjects weren't forced to continue, but on the contrary, were encouraged to stop. The result? 70% still went all the way to the end. We do not change. Thank you for watching. Write in the comments which experiments scare you the most, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the dark side of human nature.